Hello and welcome back. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past couple weeks, you've probably noticed that Starship had its second flight, and it was mostly successful. With these first two flight tests, there's been a lot of talk about Starship being the biggest rocket of all time, so in its honor, I decided to do an exhaustive history of every single biggest rocket of all time. First of all, what is big? Well, I'm going to use 4 different measurements, all of which have some claim to being the biggest rocket of all time. The first 2 are physical measurements, mass and height, and the other 2 will be performance-based, starting with the payload to low Earth orbit, and then the thrust of the rocket. To qualify, a rocket must have left the ground at some point. I am going to include failed missions, but I will mention any time that the current record holder achieved its record with an unsuccessful mission. Also, just to be clear, this is only looking at rockets that are at least intended to be orbital. If I wanted to do every kind of rocket, I would have to go through 1,000 years of human history, most of which has no good record for the performance of the rockets. And even if I just wanted to do rockets that cross the Kármán line, there's still not a ton of great documentation because that dates back to the Second World War. But if I stick to orbital rockets, we have a firm start date and decent records for all of them. Also, you probably won't be surprised to hear that orbital rockets are the biggest rockets once we, invented them. So given those rules, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that the first record holder was Sputnik, the world's first satellite, which was launched on October 4th, 1957 by the Soviet Union on an R7-derived rocket called the 8K71PS. It had a gross mass of 267 tons, it stood 30 meters tall, and could carry 500 kilograms to orbit using 3,890 kilonewtons of thrust. Now this rocket's going to look familiar whether you're a history buff or not, because the R7 has basically been the backbone of the Soviet and Russian space programs. To this day, Russia is still flying the Soyuz, which is just the latest in the long line of upgraded R7s, meaning that even 66 years later, we are still copying the homework of the very first orbital rocket. Now, despite winning by default, this is still a massive rocket. For context, here are the first 4 US orbital rockets, and none of them got anywhere near matching the numbers of the R7. So with that context, it shouldn't be a surprise that over the next 4 years, more R7 variants would gradually increase the record. In 1958, Sputnik 3 launched on an 8A91, which was slightly heavier at 268 tons, 31.1 meters tall, and it could carry up to 1,327 kilograms to low Earth orbit. But it actually has a lower published thrust for some reason. I'm not sure what's going on there. Also, I have to point out that this mission did fail due to pogo oscillations, which is where a rocket bounces up and down like a pogo stick. Later that same year, another version, the 8K72, was launched as part of the Luna program. It also failed to reach orbit due to more pogo oscillations, but it did increase the numbers. Mass went up to 277 tons, and payload to low Earth orbit went up to 4,000 kilograms. Then in May of 1960, Vostok L claimed the height and payload records with the successful launch of the Korabl Sputnik 1 mission. That brings our height to 38.4 meters and our payload to low Earth orbit to 4,550 kilograms. Then in October, another Soviet rocket called Molniya set new records for mass at 305 tons, height at 43.4 meters, and I think thrust at 3,997 kilonewtons, though I'm not sure how confident I am in that number. Also, the mission, which was carrying a Mars probe, had a loss of control late in the mission, causing it to be terminated. Now that sketchy thrust number doesn't really matter because in December, Vostok-K claimed the thrust record at 4,795 kilonewtons, but its third stage did fail, meaning the mission was a failure, but 2 dogs that were on board actually survived the landing. And that's the end of the R7 variant's run as the world's biggest rockets. It wasn't the cleanest, but all of these variants did go on to have some successful missions later on. If anything, this should just show you how little we understood about rocketry in the very early days of spaceflight. But finally, after 4 years, the US joins the record books with the first successful launch of the Saturn I. This happened on October 27th, 1961, wiping the board with a mass of 510 tons, a height of 57.4 meters, a payload mass of 9,000 kilograms, and a thrust of 6,700 kilonewtons. Now, I usually think of the Saturn I as a baby Saturn V, so I was a little surprised to see that it took all 4 records, and especially that it held them for almost 4 years. Also, I do have to point out just how early on this is. This was the first flight in the Apollo program, which had just been named. It happened 5 months after the very first crewed Mercury flight, meaning the very first time an American had gone into space, and it was almost 3 whole years before the first launch of the Gemini program, which is considered the bridge between Mercury and Apollo. The Saturn I, or specifically the Saturn 1B, is one of my favorite rockets, so I'm kind of surprised that I never noticed this before. But anyway, almost 4 years later, on June 18th of 1965, the US launched a rocket called the Titan IIIC, which had a mass of 626 tons, carried 11,500 kilograms to LEO, and had 10,587 kilonewtons of thrust, a massive leap, thanks mostly to these giant SRBs. Yeah, these are 2 solid rocket boosters that are basically the same size as the entire first stage. The Titan IIIC is a cartoon rocket. About a month later, on July 16, 1965, the Proton rocket, also known as the UR-500, successfully launched its first satellite, and with it, it claimed a new mass record of 693 tons, and a payload mass record of 12,200 kilograms for the Soviet Union. On February 26, 1966, the Saturn 1B had its first successful flight, carrying an uncrewed Apollo capsule. This increased its height slightly, bringing it up to 68.1 meters. Then on March 10, 1967, the Proton-K launched, which briefly increased the maximum payload record to 19,760 kilograms. But that record would be short-lived, because on November 9th of the same year, Apollo 4 successfully launched another uncrewed Apollo capsule, but this time on top of the massive Saturn V moon rocket. This was more than a 4x increase in mass, up to 2,965 tons. It stood over 110 meters tall. It had a 7x increase in payload mass, up to 140,000 kilograms, and it tripled the thrust of that ridiculous Titan IIIC, all the way to 34,500 kilonewtons. Obviously claiming all 4 records and becoming the biggest rocket in history. And that perfect record stood for just over a year, until the first launch of the N1 on February 21st, 1969. This was the Soviet moon rocket. It wasn't quite as massive, it wasn't quite as tall, and it couldn't carry as much payload, but it did have 30% more thrust at 45,400 kilonewtons. This mission did fail, and this is actually the first record holder that never had a successful flight. The N1 only flew 4 times before it was canceled, and none of those flights even made it past the first stage. Despite this major caveat, this was a massive achievement, and it would cement the record books for an unprecedented 54 years. Now, I do have some honorable mentions from that period. Even if you're unhappy with the N1 holding the thrust record, it still would have been claimed by the Soviets in their last hurrah with the Energia rocket. This massive heavy lift rocket was part of the Buran program, which was the Soviets' attempt to make a space shuttle. The first launch was a mostly successful cargo mission on May 15, 1987, and the second and final launch of this rocket was a successful test of the uncrewed Buran space shuttle on November 15, 1988. This rocket had a thrust of 35,130 kilonewtons, which is slightly more than the Saturn V, but less than the N1. The next rocket to beat that number would be the SLS, which launched just over a year ago on November 16th of 2022. This was the first launch of the Artemis program. It successfully launched an Orion capsule around the moon on a rocket with 39,000 kilonewtons of thrust. That's, again, more than the Saturn V, more than the Energia, but it still fell 5,000 kilonewtons below the N1. So despite being named the largest operational rocket when it launched, SLS has actually never held any of the 4 records. And now we finally reached this year, 2023, when on April 20th, SpaceX launched the first test flight of Starship. It was ugly. The pad was completely destroyed and shot concrete everywhere. 3 of the 33 first stage engines never even lit. The whole stack lost control before it even got over the Kármán line and had to be terminated, and it was a highly unsuccessful termination at that. Despite all of these problems, it still would have beaten the thrust of the N1. It was taller than the Saturn V, heavier than Saturn V, and could carry more payload than the Saturn V. But throughout this entire list, I've always been using the best possible numbers for every rocket, mostly for simplicity of research, so let's fast forward to the second test flight of Starship. On November 18th, 2023, Starship took off again, this time with all 33 engines running all the way up to stage separation, and then the spacecraft made it almost all the way to its target orbital velocity, where something happened. There's no official word yet, but it caused the second stage to shut down before it reached that velocity and it had to be terminated. And this second flight brings us to the current record, with a mass of 5,000 tons, a height of 121 meters, a payload mass of 150 kilograms, and a thrust of 75,900 kilonewtons. Again, this has the caveat of never successfully reaching orbit, but unlike the N1, Starship's not really in danger of being canceled anytime soon. So to me, it seems extremely likely that this rocket will make it to orbit someday, and there's a chance it will actually improve on these numbers. So for now, I have no issue naming Starship the biggest rocket in history by any metric. I'm Happy, and I'll see you in the next video.